All right, everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing classical civilization in the Mediterranean, which is chapter 4 in our Stern's textbook of Greece and Rome. And the reason we combine Greece and Rome is because they're both in the Mediterranean first, but also Greece is sort of the foundation, the cultural foundation, religious foundation, a little bit of the political foundation for Rome, which came later. Rome borrowed very heavily, I guess I should say, from the very beginning. So I'm going to discuss first Greece. I'm going to skip over a lot of these stops on this Prezi because it's something that you can find on your own. And I want to first just kind of get started talking about how Greece came to be the classical form that we recognize. You notice here, this is the geography of Greece. This is the Peloponnesian Peninsula. You can see it has this little connection here next to the Gulf of Corinth. It's a peninsula, but it also has a lot of these islands. But you can also see it's very mountainous. This became a problem because it's kind of hard to have unity, as we've already discussed. China was able to have isolated and independent unity because they had the natural barriers cutting them off from the rest of the world. India was adaptable because they had contact with other outside people, but they were also able to create the dynasties, were able to create the big empires. We don't see that in Greece because because of this mountainous geography and topography, they were not able to, like Pylos and Mycenae and Aegea and Athens, were not able to effectively communicate with one another, so they just developed their own way of doing things. I'm going to skip ahead of all this. I strongly recommend that you view this on your own so you can see all the information that I'm skipping. So our story we're going to look at begins right around the year 700 BCE. And this is where we start to see Greece as we see it, as we know it in the classical period, come into be. We see all these cities here, Pylos, Sparta, Mycenae, Athens, Thebes, Corinth. The reason they developed that way is because the polis, the city-state, is a lot easier to organize and maintain, sort of with the early river valley civilizations, the way the cities would be the way people first started civilization. Well, that's how it happened in Greece as well. City-states were totally self-contained. They had their own form of government, and we were going to see varying forms from democracy to oligarchy to tyranny to different forms. They have their own god or goddess whom they worship. They have their own social structure, their own understanding of the world around them. So the city-state is the basic political unit of Greece at this point. And you notice I said political unit, polis. If you think of any word that you can imagine, metropolis, police, political, it all comes back to this root in this Greek understanding of the city-state. The city-states they were all Greek in culture and in language, but they were sometimes friendly competition, like we see in the Olympics, where they would get together and show off their best athletes, which, by the way, were always men who always were watched by other men. There was no women allowed in competition or in the spectators. So they had friendly competition, but they also had some sometimes not so friendly competition. Mainly, the two people we see having not so friendly competition was Sparta. Unfortunately, Hollywood has given you a view through the 300 if you saw that movie, which if you didn't, don't bother, of Sparta. They did a decent job, I think, of trying to show some of the really cool quotes, but a very poor job at telling the story of Thermopylae. So Sparta, the big story about Sparta is they were an oligarchy. An oligarchy is a rule by a select few. In the case of Sparta, they would have two kings, and they would have advisors that went along with that, but really they were more like a monarchy in that they had a kingship, but they were an oligarchy because only a handful of people were able to run the city-state. Everybody else, the other citizens, were not able to participate. Sparta was military-centered, almost a military dictatorship, if you want to describe it that way. From 7, boys would be taken they would leave home and go to the barracks where they'd begin training to be a warrior. Their lives revolved around the military because they had a very large slave population that they had to keep control over. The reason they became military-centered was way back in their history. The people that they had enslaved, the Messenians, revolted and tried to rise up. They managed to put them down, but they realized they have to be able to have a military to maintain the slave class which is providing the sustenance, the basic production. Well, on maybe the opposite side, if Sparta was very military-centered, the matters of the physical side of life, Athens was focused on the intellectual or mental side of life. They were a democracy, which demos means of the hand. And so this was ruled by the citizens. which we in the United States are not a democracy. We are a democratic republic. Athens was actually a direct democracy where they had tens of thousands of citizens who all directly participated in the governance of the city-state of Athens. Now, as a result, they as well had to have a very large slave class, but they also had non-citizens who were Athenian but were not citizens. They couldn't participate, so that those citizens could devote their time to running the city-state. They didn't have to worry about working. That's why we are not a democracy. We have jobs, we have to work. We vote for representatives to do the governing for us. Very famous name, and you probably remember from the DBQ that we've done, Pericles. He's kind of called the father of Athenian democracy because during a time period where these two were fighting, Pericles gave a speech whenever the dead soldiers from Athens were brought home at one point, called a very famous speech called Pericles' funeral oration, where he basically said, we call our government a democracy. So this is sort of the beginning of our, in the West, form of government, the Athenians. The Athenians were very concerned, as I said, with matters of the mind. So philosophy comes from the word philo and sophia. Philo, which is a love, like a brotherly love, and sophia, wisdom. So they loved wisdom. Some very famous philosophers, Socrates, kind of the father of Western philosophy, his student, who was Plato, and then his student, who was Aristotle. Aristotle comes into play being important later because he's the teacher to Alexander the Great. But they were interested in discussing what life is, why we're here, how do we know that we're real, that the world is real, that we exist, and lots of really cool brain-bending things that I'll be discussing with you further in class. It is important for you to use your extra resources and look up some of the particulars of Socrates' philosophy, Plato's philosophy, Aristotle's philosophy. Plato, I've always thought, is the most interesting of them. But Aristotle is, of course, very influential as well because we see his influence later on. He's sort of the basis for all of Western science until the Renaissance, really. And the Renaissance is when they sort of rediscovered him, and then they start realizing a lot of the stuff that they thought all along was wrong. We see a couple of other forms of government that develop. Tyranny is one, which for us means an evil bad guy, military-type dictator maybe, who takes power by force. For the Greeks, it wasn't necessarily a good thing, but it wasn't a bad thing either. A tyrant was not necessarily a bad guy. A tyrant was just one man who had power. Then we have aristocracy, which is rule by the upper class or rule by the wealthy. It's similar to an oligarchy because it's only a few people in power, but in this case it's based on class or wealth. So aristocracy is something that you will need to be familiar with down the line. Now, the Persian Wars is a very cool, very interesting time period because this is where the Persian Empire, which we see in green over here, begun, if you recall from your text and from if you knew the movie The 300, Cyrus the Great was the guy who kind of started the push into the Peloponnesian Peninsula. His descendant, Xerxes, is the one that's featured in the 300 movie, where there's a couple of really important battles that we see. There's the Battle of Marathon, which I'll zoom in here, which hopefully sounds familiar, the Battle of Marathon up this way, where the Athenians were alerted that they had won the battle because a man named Phidippides ran 26.2 miles to tell them that he won. If that number sounds familiar, that's why we now have the race called a marathon, because this messenger ran 26.2 miles. And then he dropped dead, which is why I'm never going to run a marathon, because if Phidippides died, I don't even want to test it. Then the famous one, the Battle of Thermopylae, which means hot gates. This is where there was a religious festival going on, and the rest of the Greek city-states weren't going to participate because it's carnea, which carne, if you're familiar with that, if in Spanish, meat, it was basically a festival of meat. Anyway, it was a religious ceremony, and the Greeks took their religion very seriously, and they could not go to war, and they couldn't do things like that during this religious festival. So the Spartans recognized the threat, but there was nothing they could do. But there was a king, one of the kings, as I mentioned, they had two kings, Leonidas, who took his personal bodyguards of 300 Spartans to go try to stop the approaching Persians at the pass of Thermopylae, which you can see up here. Along the way, because here's Sparta, along the way he's stopping and picking up other people. Thebes and Corinth are also featured heavily. So in the end, they ended up with about 8,000 soldiers facing off against about 200,000 Persians. This is where it's one of those amazing last stand type things where the Spartans were not going to leave. They went there intending to die. Very cool, and there's some really cool stories we'll be talking about in class. But do make sure you know that these battles were important turning points in either slowing the Persian advance or actually defeating, until the final battle in the Persian Wars, where the Battle of Salamis, where there was no problem, and the Athenian navy actually helped secure victory for the Greeks. It was short-lived, however, as we can see on this little timeline. It was short-lived because this Peloponnesian War breaks out between the two rivals that I mentioned previously, Athens and Sparta. Athens has their what's called the Delian League, where they have their allies against Sparta and their allies. And it's called the Peloponnesian War because it was only people fighting, or the main people fighting from the Peloponnesian Peninsula. So this is an important time period because Sparta ends up winning, which is a bad thing for democracy. Athens, this is during the Peloponnesian War that Pericles makes his famous speech. Athens kind of just has to submit, and they are no more a leader. So because of the infighting and because the Athenians were really good at government and matters of the mind, and the Spartans were really good at war, but then the Spartans had to be in government, the Spartans got bad at war, and they weren't very good at government either, which means Greece was ripe for the taking. So Philip II of Macedon, which here's Macedonia up this way, was able to invade and start to conquer. The story gets really interesting because Alexander the Great is the guy that officially takes over the Greeks, and because he was trained by Aristotle, he grew up with Greek culture and a love of the Greeks, but also very interested in, open-minded, I suppose, that as he creates his gigantic empire, which spreads from Greece all the way over to India, you can see the Indus Valley here, he creates this massive empire. If you notice the dates, his empire at 332, and then within, as you can see, 6 years, he's conquered all the way this way. Massively successful. And he creates the Hellenistic world, the Hellenistic age, where Greek culture and learning is spread throughout the Middle East all the way towards India. And there's a really great exchange of ideas, culture, language, learning, all throughout his empire. Something also interesting is that he really loved his name. You can see here, he named multiple cities after himself. But these are the cities that he would have also founded along the way, built in the Greek style or built with Greek influence. So we have our Persian chart. We've already discussed the politics. You do need to make sure you know the city-state model of government, as well as the big ones: oligarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, and most importantly, democracy. Economics, you do need to make sure you find the extra resources on that, especially with your test prep guide, how it was mostly segregated, segmented society, and it's patriarchal, mostly sea-based, but their economic activity was heavily dependent on slavery. Religion, which is something probably you're most familiar with, where they have the pantheon, which is the group of gods with Zeus, the father god, at the top, and all the different gods that do different things. Social structure kind of goes along with the economics, because you have the aristocrats or the landowners, and like we see in Athens, who would be the citizens. You do sort of have a middle class, and then you have a lower class, and then the slave class. This is important to see for their society, simply because, or mainly because, it gives us a snapshot that we can then compare to other societies around. Something that we might notice is it's very similar, upper class down to slaves, very similar to other people. Moving right along. Intellectual. The Greeks are very important for some of the contributions they've made, which we still use today. Some of which I'm not so happy about, like geometry. Kind of I'm glad Euclid is dead, because that was not a fun class for me. Pythagoras should sound familiar, Pythagorean theorem. These two men, their contributions actually are still in use in your geometry class, in algebra, whatever math class you're taking. We owe directly to thousands of years ago these men looking